Hello everybody, this is lesson 8 of lecture International Economics. I will discuss slide 170 to 180. In this lesson we will consider the trade policy doctrine called import substitution policy. From the time period starting with the global economic crisis in the year 1929 up to the 70s of the last century, most developing countries practiced a trade regime called import substitution policy. From a historical point of view, import substitution policy was a reaction to the world economic crisis of the year 1929. World trade collapsed after the world economic crisis until the end of the Second World War, mainly because of import restrictions introduced by the United States, the so-called Smoot-Hawley Act with import tariffs up to 60%, and in Europe, here we practiced mostly restrictions on foreign exchange, which have the same effect as import tariffs. These type of import restrictions had been introduced to support domestic production by some domestic demand. As a result, many developing countries did not have the opportunity to earn foreign exchange to buy imported goods. Therefore, they started to substitute formerly imported goods by domestic production. The theoretical foundation of this type of import substitution policy reaches back to the German economist Friedrich List, who, in his book The National System of Political Economy, had propagated the import substitution policy as a policy of educational tariff, in German Erziehungszoll. The theoretical foundation of the import substitution policy is as follows. Most industries for technologically superior goods, today called high-tech goods, are determined by strong economies of scale. As a result of import competition from developed countries, high-tech industry can therefore not reach a competitive size in developing countries. Therefore, developing countries should protect their domestic industries from import competition until they have become adult. This means until they have reached a competitive size. However, the empirical results of this import substitution policy were mostly not really convincing. First problem was that two small local industries emerged, unable to take advantage of their economies of scale due to the limitation of their domestic markets. As a result, their productivity was typically much lower than that of the industries in developed countries. Second problem was high prices and low quality of goods of the domestic import substitution industries because of domestic oligopolistic or monopolistic market structures due to a lack of competition from the world market. Most surprisingly, however, countries with import substitution policies did not develop an export sector. The so-called Lerner symmetry theorem provides a simple explanation for this. It says, in the presence of import tariffs, the strong labor demand of the import substitution industries pushes wages and prices for other immobile production factors upward. This increases the domestic production costs for the export industries such that they cannot take advantage of their comparative advantages. I would like to illustrate this verbal description of the Lerner symmetry theorem with the help of a two-sector model. So this is two-sector model of domestic economy. We have an export sector which represents all the goods that are exported, and an import sector which represents the goods that are imported. So these are two different type of markets with different type of goods. Starting point is again specialization of the country under free trade. Then we will introduce an import tariff, and then we will see what the import tariff does with the export sector according to the Lerner symmetry theorem. So in the export sector we have a world market price which is above the domestic autarky price, therefore we have exports. This is consumption, domestic consumption in the export sector. This is domestic production, and the difference is exported. In the import sector, the world market price is below the domestic autarky price, such that domestic consumption is larger as domestic production, and the difference between consumption and production is imported. If now an import tariff is implemented, domestic production in the import sector will grow. So let's introduce a relatively large import tariff of this size. We can call this import tariff prohibitive because it is above the autarky price, which means no imports will take place. So this import tariff is that large that it prohibits imports. It's therefore a prohibitive import tariff. What will be the domestic price under this import tariff? Well, given the old world market price, we have obviously more domestic demand as domestic production. So this is excess demand. And excess demand drives the price upward until excess demand has disappeared. So we will end up therefore in a situation where the domestic price equals the autarky price. But if import tariffs are that high that no imports take place, we live de facto under autarky. Therefore, domestic production will now grow. Domestic producers will produce more to substitute the imports. We have an increase of production. And now the important argument of the Lerner symmetry theorem is this increase of production causes an increase of the demand for domestic production factors, primarily for domestic workers, but also other type of immobile production factors such as real estate, or natural resources and the like. So production at home gets more expensive. This increases the production costs not only for the import substitution industries, but of course also for the export industries. And this means that the supply of export industries is now shrinking, such that exports are shrinking. So we have to shift the supply curve to the left or upward. Be careful, if we shift supply curve upward, that means supply gets smaller. If we shift it downward, it means supply gets larger. Here we have to shift it upward because domestic production costs get higher because of these import substitution industries, so we have to shift this curve upward. Let's assume this is now the new curve, supply curve in the export sector. What will be the resulting export volume given the world market price? World market price has not changed. Well, exports will fall from this line segment here to only this line segment. From this intersection point, that is domestic consumption, which is still the same, to this intersection point, which is the new supply curve. So domestic production in the export sector will fall to this level. As a result, import tariffs in the import sector are crowding out domestic exports. That is the basic idea of the Lerner symmetry theorem. Due to this lack of an export sector, many import substitution countries had difficulties to earn foreign exchange to finance their energy imports when the energy prices exploded in the 1970s caused by the oil price shocks. As a result, many import substitution countries became highly indebted. Therefore, many import substitution countries drew consequences and changed their trade regime in the 80s. To increase their foreign exchange revenues, they followed the example of the so-called East Asian Tiger States and switched to the strategy of export-oriented industrialization, which we will discuss in the next section. Overall, the policy swing deepened the trade integration of most developing countries after the end of the 80s and led to what is now called globalization. In a schematic way, we can describe the rise and decline from import substitution doctrine with such a diagram here. Important time marks in this process had been the world economic crisis of 1929, the end of World War II, the 80s, and the 90s. The first countries which introduced import substitution policies had been the Latin American countries, as we have just seen. When countries in Asia and Africa became independent at the end of colonialism after World War II mainly, they adapted the import substitution policies of the independent Latin American countries. For a long time, the only counterpart of these countries had been Japan. Japan had followed an autarky-oriented trade policy in the 18th century, and experienced as a consequence a technological and economic backfall in the 18th century. When this became obvious, Japan changed deliberately its trade policy and developed a policy doctrine which today is called export-oriented industrialization. After the Korea War, South Korea adapted the Japanese trade doctrine. Since it was quite successful from the beginning on, other Southeast Asian countries followed, like Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand. After a time, these countries all experienced strong economic growth and a reduction of poverty. This development became known as the Southeast Asian Economic Miracle. Other Asian countries started to copy this success and change from import substitution policy to export-oriented industrialization. After the oil price shock in the 70s, Latin American and African countries changed their trade regime also from import substitution to export-oriented industrialization. After the disintegration of the Soviet system, East European countries adopted also the export-oriented industrialization doctrine. As a result, by the end of the last century, most countries had opened for international trade and the world economy became what we call today globalized. So much for this lecture. In the next lecture, we will take a closer look to the export-oriented industrialization doctrine and the experience Southeast Asian countries had made with this doctrine.